All right, hello everyone, welcome to AP Prep Plus, and today we're going to be discussing AP Macroeconomics Unit 2.2, GDP and its limitations. So we'll just revise 2.1 and then move on to 2.2. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. Now, just going over the basics, how an economy functions, you have four key players in an economy, which is your consumers, your firms, and in between consumers and firms, you have product markets and factor markets. Factor markets are, of course, the markets where labor units are sold and, of course, bought and sold. And product markets are the markets where goods and services are supplied and sold. How this all functions is, let's say your consumers would demand, these consumers are then, of course, put into the factor market because they provide the labor. The labor is bought by firms, the firms make the goods and services, and these very goods and services are sold to a consumer. This is your circular economic flow model. And as far as spending is concerned, consumers buy these goods from the product market. The product market then, of course, uses that money to to pay the firms who sold them the goods. The firms, of course, use this money, or at least a part of it, to pay the wages of their capital and laborers. And the factor markets, of course, that money goes to the people who are part of the factor market, and that serves as income for your consumers. That's how your economy functions. Now, let's move on to the main topic, or a part of the main topic of today's lesson, which is GDP. GDP, of course, I've heard this term a billion times even before I gave the AP Macroeconomics exam, but I never knew what it was, so let's just take a look at it. The total monetary value or market value of all the finished goods and services produced within a country's borders in a specific time period, gross domestic product. Now, just make sure to distinguish between, or give attention to terms such as services produced within a country's borders in a specific time period, because that is incredibly important for you to distinguish between GDP or something like national product. Again, we'll get into that in a later video. That's not in your scope of syllabus right now. The total monetary value of finished goods and services, make sure you put emphasis on the finished goods and services, and of course, specific time period, because if we don't put time to it, you can have a GDP of 500 trillion, I don't know, from 1980 till now. But the truth is, it needs to be within 1 year. So make sure you have you have your quarterly GDPs, you have your yearly GDPs, but make sure the time period is there. In the 2022 AP May exam, I know there was a question in the MCQs which was about, what is GDP or what counts as GDP. We'll be going over some questions, so don't take stress. Just remember time period within borders and market value of finished goods and services. And when I say finished goods and services, just take an example of a house made of wood. The logs of wood won't be counted in the GDP, rather they'll be counted in the value of the house, because otherwise you'd be counting twice. You'd be counting the value of the logs and also the value of the logs in the house, but there was only just one set of logs used to build that house. So that's why we take into account finished goods and services, not incomplete materials. Now, let's quantify GDP, because at the end of the day, GDP is a number. GDP is made up of four components: consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. Net exports is the sum of course, the difference between how much a country exports and how much it imports. And of course, you obviously want to be exporting more than you import. It's good for your currency. We'll be going into that when we touch Unit 5 or 6 it is. But as of right now, C plus I plus G plus NX, or X of N, whatever you'd like to call it, net exports. Now, let's take a look at the limitations of GDP, the main topic of today's video. Like 99% of the stuff we have today, it's all human-made. God didn't, take a trip from heaven, dropped a piece of paper and said, "Hey guys, that's how you calculate GDP." The most perfect and complete economic indicator one could ask for. If life was that simple, I only wish. But like anything that's made by humans, it isn't impervious to imperfections. And let's take a look at the four flaws present in an economic indicator such as the GDP. Remember this acronym, PIES, not the 3.14, not the one you have at the Cheesecake Factory, but P for population, I for inequality, E for environment, and S for shadow economy. Let's take a look at the first one, which is population. Let's take an example of country A and B, where both produce 5,000 golf kits. I mean, one is Titleistville and one is Callawayville. I'm joking, but country A and B, where all they do is produce golf kits, like nothing else, just for simplicity purposes. Country A has a population of 5,000 people. That means, on average, one person would own one golf kit, mathematically. But country B has a population of only 1,000 people. That means, on average, one person would own 5 golf kits. And that obviously is indicative of a higher standard of living, because let's say each golf kit costs $100. The average capital owned by one person in country A would be just, well, $100, but in country B it would be $500. So 5 times as much, because the population is 1/5. And because of this role that population plays in determining the standard of living, especially when it comes to GDP, most economists tend to use GDP per capita as a more efficient way of determining standard of living. The formula for that is GDP divided by population. An example of this would be India, where it's a country with, relative to the US or the UK or the UAE, a relatively lower standard of living, but an incredibly high GDP, which one might say is, wow, India has such a high GDP. It's probably, more a higher standard of living than the UK, but it's not, because there's a population of almost over 1 billion people in India. So that's population summed up for you. Let's move on to the next one, which is inequality. Inequality is a limit because two countries can have the same GDP per capita. Country A and B, assuming, let's say they have the same GDP per capita of $100, or in this case, let's say that they both have a GDP per capita of 5 golf kits each. But in one country, you could have everyone having 5 golf kits, which is, let's say, $500 worth of capital. But in country B, half the population could have 0 golf kits and the other half could have 10. And you can see that there's a big disparity in the amount of capital owned. There's a lot of poverty in that country. So, and you can't measure that kind of inequality, because to factor in that kind of data would be an immense logistical nightmare for economists. And in terms of standard of living, they can only be measured with something known as the Gini coefficient and the Lorenz curve. You don't need to worry about this because it's covered in the AP Microeconomics exam. So we'll be making a video on that in a later, we'll make a video on that topic in a later time. But as of right now, don't worry about how you can solve this inequality, but just know that it's one of the biggest reasons why we're unable to use GDP as an accurate economic indicator of, standard of living. Now, the third one, environment. Let's revisit our example of golf kits. Let's say a factory is causing pollution while producing their golf kits. It's still going to be contributing to the GDP because, of course, they're selling the golf kits and consumers are buying that. But the issue is the GDP doesn't separate out this pollution from the actual production, even if the pollution is negatively, and more obviously, negatively impacting human life and ecology. You don't have C plus I plus G plus NX, and then you minus the environmental negative externality caused by the production of these golf kits. We don't account for the environmental damage that's caused by the products being sold, which means we're not actually giving an accurate estimate of what damages were done, because of course you are going to be losing out on something somewhere else in terms of, let's say, human life because of pollution, but we can't account for that in our GDP, and that's what makes the GDP further away from being an accurate indicator of economic well-being. Now, the fourth one, and in my opinion, the most important part of any economic indicator, because there is no way you can account for this. It's a shadow economy. And let me clarify. There are ways to account for, other parts of it, like inequality or environment. There are certain indicators that use different methods. Of course, slightly biased towards those methods, like you have the happiness national index and some others. But there are ways to measure those elements. You can measure inequality with your Gini coefficient, but you cannot measure the magnitude of a shadow economy. Let me explain. shadow economy involves the production of items that are not reported, so they don't count in the GDP. And items in a shadow economy could be perfectly illegal. I mean, uh, when I first read the word shadow economy in my textbook, I thought that's the place where everyone's wearing hoodies and sunglasses and selling drugs. But that's not it. There are some instances of, of course, that is a part of the shadow economy. You don't count the sale of guns and drugs in places where, of course, that's illegal. But an example of a legal part of the shadow economy would be something like a yard sale, where individuals are selling used goods. But we don't count them because, like I gave an example with the logs and the house before, we don't want to double count a certain item in our GDP. In essence, that let's say someone were selling their golf clubs at a yard sale. Those golf clubs were already purchased once, and them being purchased again it's going to be a logistical nightmare to count that in. And not to mention, you're counting one item twice as if it was two different items. You don't, because that item was only realistically sold once and then just passed on. So we don't count it in the GDP. And the problem is one which is quite impossible to solve. And even if, let's say one day I wake up and I decide to solve it, it would be at an incredibly complex and costly logistical system. Imagine having to record each and every item being sold around the world. Until quantum computing or something is invented, there's no way we're solving this. And that's it. PIES, PIES, population, inequality, environment, and shadow economy. That's all the limitations you have with the GDP. You don't need to worry about other indicators because they don't really ask about it in the AP exam. But if you guys would like, just let me know in the comments and I'll make a video about other economic indicators. That's all from me. Grazie a tutti. I'm a bit of a learning Italian, so why not? Thank you so much for watching this video, and stay tuned. We'll be doing more quizzes, and I'll upload a drive link with the link to this PPT so you guys can access it. Thank you.